The Yard of Blood. Smash that subscribe button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and like this video if you want the truth no one else will show you, because this story will drag you inside a prison where the walls themselves hid crimes too dark for daylight. The birth of a prison meant for control. When Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989, it was supposed to be California's crown jewel of correctional control. Built on the fog-choked edge of Crescent City, just miles from the Oregon border, it was designed to cage the worst of the worst. The architecture alone told the story: endless concrete blocks, high-tech electronic gates, and the Security Housing Unit, SHU. A windowless labyrinth where men could be sealed away in solitary confinement for years at a time. Politicians touted Pelican Bay as the answer to gang violence that had torn through California's other penitentiaries. By locking away shot callers, the state believed it could starve gangs of leadership. The SHU cells, stark and fluorescent lit, were meant to break communication and crush influence. But in reality, Pelican Bay didn't break the gangs. It bred something darker. The guards who wanted a show. Inside those early years, tension was electric. The prison held members of the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, groups that treated the prison yards as battlegrounds for control. Every meal, every glance, every whispered word carried the risk of violence. And some of the correctional officers didn't just watch. They participated. Whispers spread among inmates about gladiator fights, violent clashes staged not by gang orders but by the very men sworn to enforce order. Officers allegedly engineered these encounters for entertainment, opening yard gates to rival groups at the same time, letting them battle while guards watched from catwalks with rifles trained but fingers off the trigger. For the officers it was a game. For the inmates, it was survival of the fittest. Stories from the yard. Survivors would later testify about those days. An inmate recalled how two rival gang members were suddenly released into the yard together. At first, they paced, circling each other, uncertain if it was a mistake. Then, as realization hit, fists flew, blades appeared, and blood slicked the concrete. Guards didn't rush in. They waited, sometimes minutes, until one man lay bleeding and motionless. Only then did they intervene, dragging the survivor away, battered and victorious, to solitary confinement. Another prisoner described the eerie cheers from guards stationed above, their laughter echoing across the yard as if the blood below was sport. To the men forced into these confrontations, it was as though the prison had turned into a Roman arena, with their bodies as the entertainment. A system of fear. These weren't isolated incidents. Rumors turned to patterns. Men began to dread the sound of gates unlocking. They whispered about the green light, the signal from guards that meant blood was about to flow. The knowledge spread. Rival gangs didn't need to orchestrate every fight. Sometimes, the men in uniform were orchestrating it for them. Inmates claimed that guards used these fights as tools of manipulation. A prisoner who caused trouble might suddenly find himself released with a rival, his fate sealed by officers who wanted to make an example. Others believed it was a way to keep the prison under control, let the men destroy each other so the guards could tighten their grip. But under the fluorescent buzz of Pelican Bay's SHU, it created something else. An atmosphere of terror where inmates trusted neither rivals nor the officers sworn to guard them. Von Dorch, the face of abuse. One of the darkest cases to emerge from Pelican Bay was that of Von Dorch, a mentally ill African-American inmate. In 1992, Dorch was suffering from severe psychiatric issues when guards allegedly forced him into scalding water while handcuffed. His body was covered in second and third-degree burns, his skin peeling away in strips. A nurse present later testified in court, saying she could smell his skin burning. The image of Dorch, broken, burned, and humiliated, became a symbol of the brutality festering behind Pelican Bay's walls. And it wasn't a story whispered in cells. It was splashed across court records, a piece of evidence impossible to ignore. The investigators step in. By the early 1990s, Pelican Bay's reputation was no longer a secret. Advocacy groups, journalists, and eventually federal investigators began to shine a light on the prison's darkest practices. The accounts painted a consistent, harrowing picture. Excessive force by guards. Indifference to medical needs. A pattern of staged violence in the yards. Long-term solitary confinement leading to severe mental breakdowns. The more investigators dug, the more it became clear. Pelican Bay was less a correctional facility and more a controlled war zone, where rules bent under the weight of unchecked authority. Madrid versus Gomez, the case that blew it open. In 1995, the lawsuit Madrid versus Gomez brought these horrors into a federal courtroom. The case was named after prisoner Jesus Madrid, who suffered abuse inside Pelican Bay, and James Gomez, then director of the California Department of Corrections. Inmates testified about gladiator fights orchestrated by guards, about excessive force used not as discipline but as cruelty. Medical staff described conditions so neglectful they bordered on torture. And lawyers laid bare a system where men were kept in solitary confinement for decades, their minds unraveling in the isolation of the SHU. The testimony of Von Dorch and the image of his burned body seared itself into the case. Judge Thelton Henderson's ruling was damning. He declared that the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment had been violated inside Pelican Bay. The prison, he wrote, was a place where constitutional rights went to die. The unmasking of the arena. The revelations from the case confirmed what had long been whispered in the cells, that Pelican Bay's guards had orchestrated violent confrontations, turning human lives into a spectacle. The gladiator fights were no longer rumor. They were part of the record. Judge Henderson ordered sweeping reforms, better medical care, psychiatric treatment, and stricter limits on the use of force. But the scars, physical and psychological, remained. For the men who had been forced to bleed for amusement, justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. As the 1990s rolled on, Pelican Bay carried the weight of the ruling. The world had finally glimpsed the blood that soaked its yards and the burns that scarred its inmates. But behind the concrete, whispers persisted. Reforms were written, but could rules really bind a culture forged in violence? Could a court order erase the years of pain carved into the prison's DNA? Because even as the ink dried on Judge Henderson's decision, new stories began to surface. Stories of hunger strikes. Stories of retaliation. Stories that suggested the fights weren't over, only hidden deeper. And the question remained, had Pelican Bay truly changed, or had it just become better at hiding the blood? Starving for justice. Like this video if you want the truth hidden behind locked doors. Drop your comments with what you do in their place and subscribe, because the fight you're about to witness shook an entire state and forced the world to look at what Pelican Bay was really hiding. After the courtroom, back to the cells. The Madrid versus Gomez decision in 1995 was supposed to mark a turning point for Pelican Bay State Prison. Judge Thelton Henderson's ruling condemned excessive force, brutality, and medical neglect. California officials promised reform. Policies were rewritten. Oversight committees were announced. But for the men sealed inside the Security Housing Unit, SHU, little changed. The SHU remained a concrete coffin, 8 by 10 cells, no windows, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and a slot in the steel door through which food trays slid. Inmates were confined 22.5 to 23 hours per day. Exercise meant an hour in a dog run, a barren cage with nothing but gray walls and open sky. There were no classes, no programs, no visits beyond plexiglass. And there was no end date. Inmates could spend decades in the SHU, not for crimes committed inside prison but for their affiliation. If a guard claimed they were tied to a gang, if a drawing or a tattoo was labeled gang-related, they could be locked down indefinitely. For many, the SHU became a sentence worse than life. The psychological toll. Experts compared long-term solitary confinement to torture. Prison psychiatrists reported a spectrum of breakdowns. Men pacing endlessly in circles. Prisoners talking to themselves for hours, their voices echoing through the tier. Others banging their heads against walls until blood pooled on the floor. One inmate later wrote, "I've been in the SHU for so long, I talk to the ants that crawl through the cracks. They're the only living things I see." By the early 2000s, Pelican Bay had over 1,000 men in solitary, many locked away for 10, 15, even 20 years. Some hadn't hugged their families in decades. The court ruling had forced reforms on paper, but the system of isolation as control only deepened. Seeds of rebellion. Among those buried alive in Pelican Bay's SHU was Todd Ashker, a man convicted of second-degree murder in the 1980s. Ashker had become one of the most vocal critics of indefinite solitary confinement. Alongside other long-term SHU prisoners, men like Arturo Castellanos, Sidawa Jama, and Antonio Guillen, he began drafting letters, legal filings, and essays that made their way to the outside world. They weren't asking for freedom. They were asking for humanity. An end to indefinite SHU terms. Basic contact visits with family. Access to educational programs. Medical treatment for those deteriorating in isolation. For years their appeals were ignored. But slowly momentum built. Advocacy groups like the Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition amplified their voices. Journalists began to take notice. Legislators fielded uncomfortable questions. By 2011, the prisoners decided words weren't enough. They would use the only weapon left to them, their bodies. The 2011 hunger strike. On July 1, 2011, Pelican Bay erupted, not with violence but with silence. More than 1,000 inmates in the SHU refused their meals. The strike quickly spread beyond Pelican Bay, reaching other California prisons. Within days, over 6,600 inmates across the state were refusing food in solidarity. Their demands were simple but powerful. End group punishment for individual actions. Abolish the debriefing process that forced inmates to snitch to escape the SHU. Limit solitary confinement terms. Provide adequate food, clothing, and medical care. Expand educational and rehabilitation programs. As days turned into weeks, men grew weak. Some fainted in their cells. Others were taken to prison hospitals, their bodies shutting down from starvation. The strike forced California officials to the negotiating table. Promises were made, reviews of SHU terms, modest reforms, and dialogue with prisoner representatives. After 3 weeks, the strike ended. But inside the cells, inmates whispered the same refrain: "They're stalling. Nothing will change." Retaliation and resistance. In the months that followed, some prisoners who had led the strike claimed they were targeted. Their mail was intercepted. Visits were restricted. Some were transferred to other prisons, severing the fragile bonds they had built. California corrections officials insisted they were reviewing policies, but SHU numbers remained high. Inmates continued to languish in solitary for years without end. For the men who had risked death by starvation, it was a betrayal. And so, in 2013, they prepared to strike again. The 2013 hunger strike, a statewide uprising. On July 8, 2013, Pelican Bay's SHU fell silent once more. This time, the movement spread faster and wider. At its peak, over 30,000 prisoners across California joined the hunger strike, refusing food in one of the largest prison protests in U.S. history. The strike lasted 60 days. Some inmates lost 20, 30, even 40 pounds. Doctors warned of organ failure. Families gathered outside prison gates with banners demanding justice. Politicians faced mounting pressure as international media covered the story. The message was clear: Pelican Bay had become the symbol of a broken system. Inside the negotiations, behind closed doors, California officials scrambled. The Department of Corrections faced lawsuits, public scrutiny, and the growing risk of death inside the SHU. For the first time, prisoner representatives were allowed to meet with legislators and state officials. Shackled, frail, but defiant, men like Ashker explained the torment of decades in solitary. They pointed to scars, mental and physical, that would never heal. One lawmaker admitted, "We didn't realize how bad it was until the world forced us to see the cost of starvation." By late August, the strike ended. Some inmates could barely walk. Others required 4 drips. The toll was immense, but their sacrifice had carved cracks in the walls of Pelican Bay. In 2015, after sustained legal battles, the case Ashker versus Governor of California finally settled. The agreement ended indefinite solitary confinement in California. No longer could inmates be buried in the SHU for decades based solely on alleged gang affiliation. Step-down programs were created to give prisoners a path back to general population. It was a historic victory, won not with fists or riots, but with empty stomachs and unbreakable resolve. But the fight came at a cost. Guards resented the concessions. Administrators quietly found loopholes. And for some prisoners, freedom from the SHU simply meant transfer to another kind of cage. As the 2010s wore on, a haunting question lingered. Had the hunger strikes truly ended the brutality, or had Pelican Bay simply found new ways to keep men broken? Because even as reforms were celebrated, new allegations surfaced. Of retaliation, of mental illness untreated, of men who never recovered from years in the SHU. And buried beneath it all was a darker truth. The culture of power inside Pelican Bay had not disappeared. It had only adapted. The legacy of shadows. Subscribe if you believe the truth should never stay locked behind prison walls. Drop your comments on whether you think reform was real or just another illusion, and hit the like button, because this final chapter will leave you questioning what justice really looks like inside America's most infamous supermax. The settlement that shook California. In 2015, the case Ashker versus Governor of California officially ended the practice of indefinite solitary confinement. For decades, men at Pelican Bay had been buried in the Security Housing Unit, SHU, often for nothing more than tattoos, artwork, or the word of an informant. Now, California agreed to release thousands of prisoners back to general population or to step down programs designed to wean them out of isolation. On paper it was a triumph. Civil rights groups hailed it as a landmark victory for human dignity. For the prisoners who had starved themselves in 2011 and 2013, it was proof that their suffering hadn't been in vain. But inside Pelican Bay the story was more complicated. The guards' backlash. Correctional officers had watched the hunger strikes unfold with resentment. To them the concessions weren't reforms, they were capitulations. Many officers believed the SHU had been the only tool powerful enough to control California's most dangerous gangs. Without it, they warned, violence would spill into the yards, into the chow halls, into the very veins of the prison. One officer, speaking anonymously, said, "We didn't want to see guys rot in the SHU forever. But when you put killers back into population, don't be surprised when blood spills." The officer's fears weren't unfounded. Within months of the settlement, reports of stabbings and assaults in California prisons began to rise. The Department of Corrections admitted it was struggling to manage the reintegration of long-isolated prisoners. For the guards, it felt like a vindication. For reformers, it was proof that the system had been broken for so long that no solution would come without chaos. The inmates who returned. For the men who stepped out of the SHU after 10, 15, even 25 years, freedom was not what they remembered. Some could barely walk in the open air without panic. The sudden noise of a crowded yard was overwhelming. One man described stepping into the sunlight and feeling his vision blur. "It was like my eyes had forgotten how to see distance." Others struggled with paranoia, nightmares, and hallucinations. Psychologists compared the symptoms to post-traumatic stress disorder. For them, leaving the SHU wasn't an escape, it was another kind of prison, one built inside their minds. But not everyone was broken. Some became advocates, joining coalitions to fight against solitary confinement nationwide. Men who had once been branded the worst of the worst became voices for reform, speaking at universities, testifying before lawmakers, and writing memoirs that gave the outside world a glimpse of what Pelican Bay had done to them. Pelican Bay in the spotlight. The reforms didn't erase Pelican Bay's reputation. If anything, the prison became a symbol of America's debate over mass incarceration. Documentaries, articles, and investigative reports poured out. International human rights groups compared the SHU to torture chambers. United Nations officials condemned long-term isolation as a violation of basic human rights. The world was watching, but inside the prison walls, the culture of power remained. Guards still controlled every movement, every decision, every moment of a prisoner's life. Brutality didn't vanish, it simply wore new faces. New allegations. Even after the settlement, allegations of abuse continued to surface. Prisoners reported retaliation for speaking out about conditions, medical neglect, particularly for the mentally ill, guards using excessive force during cell extractions. One particularly chilling report came from an inmate who had survived decades in the SHU only to claim he was assaulted by guards in general population. "They didn't need the SHU anymore," he wrote. "They had us in cages, and cages are cages no matter how big they are." Advocates argued that while the hunger strikes had ended one chapter of Pelican Bay's brutality, the prison system itself was still built on the same foundation: control through fear. The echo of gladiator fights. And then there were the memories. Even in the 2010s, decades after the infamous gladiator fights of the early 1990s, survivors still carried scars, both physical and psychological. In interviews, some spoke of nightmares where the clang of gates brought back the terror of being forced to fight for their lives while guards watched from above. For them, the Madrid versus Gomez ruling had not delivered justice. It had delivered acknowledgement that what they endured was real, that the arena of Pelican Bay had existed, that their blood had been spilled for the entertainment of those in power. But acknowledgement isn't the same as healing. A changing world outside. While Pelican Bay wrestled with reform, the world outside was shifting. The debate over mass incarceration exploded in the 2010s. Politicians who once championed tough-on-crime policies now faced questions about overcrowded prisons, ballooning costs, and racial disparities in sentencing. Pelican Bay became a case study. Lawmakers toured the SHU, standing inside the barren cells, trying to imagine years, or decades, of silence. Some left shaken, others unmoved. For activists, the hunger strikes had given them momentum. They pushed for broader changes across the state, reduced prison populations, alternatives to solitary, and investments in rehabilitation. But reform was slow and resistance was fierce. The legacy of the hunger strikers. Todd Ashker and the other men who had led the hunger strikes became symbols of resistance. Though still incarcerated, they continued to write, to advocate, to remind the world that the fight wasn't just about Pelican Bay, it was about the soul of the prison system itself. Their legacy was complicated. Some critics argued they had once been violent gang leaders who only turned to activism when it served them. Supporters countered that transformation was possible, and that their suffering had given them the authority to speak on behalf of the voiceless. What couldn't be denied was that their strike had changed California. Indefinite solitary confinement, once considered untouchable policy, was now legally dead. The shadows remain. And yet, Pelican Bay endures. The concrete walls still stand against the fog of Crescent City. The watchtowers still rise above the razor wire. Inside, men still serve life sentences, their days marked by the clanging of gates and the barking of orders. Reforms have come. Laws have been rewritten. Oversight has increased. But the culture, the shadows, remains. For every victory won in the courts, there are stories that never leave the cells. Stories of men broken in silence. Stories of brutality hidden in the folds of bureaucracy. Stories that remind us that the line between justice and cruelty can blur inside the belly of a prison built on fear. In 2020, decades after the first gladiator fights, a former Pelican Bay inmate was interviewed about his time in the SHU. He was asked what haunted him most: the fights, the hunger strikes, the years of isolation? He paused, then answered softly, "It wasn't the violence. It wasn't the starvation. It was realizing that to them we were never human. We were pawns. We were entertainment. And once you've been seen that way, you can never unsee it." Pelican Bay was designed to be the most secure prison in the world. Instead, it became a mirror, reflecting the darkest truths about punishment, power, and what happens when control becomes cruelty. And even now, long after the reforms, its shadows linger. Because the truth is this: Pelican Bay didn't just hold prisoners. It held secrets. And those secrets still bleed. If this story shook you, subscribe, because there are more prisons, more cases, and more hidden truths waiting to be told.